Hey, hey Scott. Good evening and welcome everybody to another webinar on addiction Q&A. Several weeks ago, because of the approaching holidays, we did kind of surviving some of the stress that goes with that. But tonight, since we're kind of still in the middle of the holidays and people are sometimes finishing or starting family visits and the New Year's holidays coming out, which introduces its own set of addiction kind of woes and triggers and other kinds of things. I thought it'd be useful to drill down a little bit on one of the techniques we use to really manage stress, and that's something called sensory grounding or five senses grounding techniques. It's simple, it's really effective. You know, we've talked about others such as gratitude lists or getting quiet, doing some breathing, but this one is a really powerful one because it really engages. It almost spreads out in your brain. The more parts of your brain, like tentacles that get touched, this exercise does it, and that makes it more powerful. So a couple of things just before we get into the actual technique. One is to really remember that feelings are really important data points for us, including things like anger, loneliness, sadness, feeling betrayed. All those things are very real, and the trick is to be able to feel them and identify them and express them. And by expressing them, it moves them. When we sit on them, when we block them, we're going to talk a lot about breathing today. When we actually kind of don't breathe them out, they stay stuck within us, they start to cause damage. And that's when we see, for example, fear, which is a very important feeling that we all need. Fear can start to move to resentment, right? Because those feelings get stuck in there and they get recycled and they move around. So recommendation one, feel the feelings as we move into this. Another just rule for the holiday, we mentioned this the other day too, is setting limits. Setting limits on spending. If you drink, spending limits on how much you drink, how much you eat, how much you act out, for God forbid. And so this is a time that all our addictive impulses are pushed to the limits, and very oftentimes they can override our ability to push back. Like our braking system gets a little bit weak because I think our bandwidth gets smaller the more stressors we have going on in our lives. And so we're very vulnerable this time of year. Even if you think you're doing okay, these things can happen. I'm sure every addict on here has had that experience of having things just change immediately it can be a text message from a using partner or an affair partner or seeing somebody or whatever, and boy, everything changes so fast. We need our tools drilled in so they're automatic to that point. Say no. We are terrible at saying no in general, and so that's another good way to set limits. It may be saying, refusing a party invitation where you really want to go, but it's your second party or third party of the night. You want to be careful of yourself, and so that often takes saying no. We've all talked in whole separate webinars about beginner's mind, which is another one. I think managing your expectations. What is my Christmas going to be like? Where am I going to be? Who's going to be there? What's my goal? What do I want? Because I don't want to have no plans and then suddenly feel like I'm missing out everything and feeling lonely and afraid, and everybody else is having all the fun, and that whole victim thing isn't ever pretty. And then finally, breathe. And this will get us right into our 5 grounding techniques. But the breathing part is so important because breath literally is one of the major ways we have to manipulate our bodies and what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And we know a lot about breath that we didn't know even a few years ago. One of the things we've learned is that when we have slower out breaths, that gives a signal to our body to relax, to slow down, to open up a little bit. And so any breathing technique you'll hear for relieving stress, like the 4-7-8 breathing we do, right? 4 to intake, 7 to hold it, but 8, a higher number, a longer time, 8 being the discharge. So the breathing piece is a really important way to start your body. It's a signal to your body to relax. And from that point, your body knows how to do it. Just we have to give it the sign, okay, now's the time, by breathing slowly out. So with that, then the sensory grounding, it's called 5 sensory grounding. And we know that when we can use each of our senses, it makes for a stronger kind of network of neural pathways that reinforce each other and kind of have a cumulative effect. And so this is a pretty simple one. It's just counting from 5 down to 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But we start after the deep breathing. we start by acknowledging 5 things we see around us. And remember, grounding techniques and any kind of mindfulness technique is meant to keep us right in the here and now. Addicts and frankly, everybody, partners, I think everybody on earth gets pulled into the past, pulled into the future. We spend very little time right here. And this is where we need to be, especially if we want to relax. And so all these grounding techniques are designed to keep us focused on the here and now. Scott has a brilliant one. I think somebody told him to do once, but look down at your feet. Where are your feet? They're in this room. They're sitting in a chair. They're in a row. They're in meetings surrounded by other addicts, whatever. But it just brings us back to the reality of the moment. So the first one, acknowledge 5 things you see. It could be a pen, a spot on the floor, anything in your surroundings, a light, something moving outside. Just it engages your senses for a moment with all your juices flowing toward your vision, and you're noticing things like Cezanne or some fine painter would notice colors and shadows that we're noticing with those 5 senses. 4, any 4 things you can touch around you. It could be your hair, it could be a pillow, it could be the ground under your feet, it could be picking up that pen you saw, but you're basically using your skin, which is the largest organ in your body, to get a signal from the environment, and it's a different kind of sensation, and it goes into your body in a different way. And so all these things are big neural channels that are going up into different parts of the brain that get all kind of put together. They're organized in a very highly administrative way by the brain that uses them to relax. So those are 4 things we could touch. Acknowledge 3 things you can hear. So this could be an external sound. It could be an internal sound. And by the way, we often go for the internal sounds more than the external. So I can hear, maybe I can hear a fire truck in the distance, or a car beeping, or other stuff outside, a dog barking. But what do I hear in me? Maybe my stomach's rumbling. Maybe I'm kind of wheezing a little bit. It may not be a lot of internal sounds coming from my body, but when they do, I think it's really important to pay attention to them, because it's the internal stressors. And by the way, this is a huge relapse prevention technique, because it builds our awareness of internal stressors that can lead to a relapse if we don't pay attention to them. And half the time addicts are so oblivious, especially in early recovery, oblivious to anything kind of below the neck. It's like we're kind of out of touch with stuff down here. And so reacquainting ourselves with all those is really important. So 3 things were things you could hear. Acknowledge 2 things you can smell. Maybe you're in your office and you can smell a pencil, or in your bedroom, you can smell a pillow, or you're making a cup of coffee and you can smell the coffee. But it just engages at the olfactory sense. And what we know about the olfactory sense is that's the oldest sense we have. Anybody that has a baby will know, those blankets and things they carry around are not necessarily, because that can be a little bit of the touch, but a lot of it is the smell, the familiarity of the smell. That's the first sense the baby develops that knows I'm safe here in this spot. And that's why those smells have tremendous power over us. In fact, smells, by the way, are the only sensory channel that goes directly from your nose to your brain, like in a dedicated circuit. Everything else gets kind of dispersed through other neural pathways. So the smell is really important. The final one is acknowledge 1 thing you can taste. What does the inside of your mouth taste like? Yeah, are you chewing gum? Are you having a cup of coffee? Do you still have memories of a sandwich you had for lunch? Whatever. So I think this idea of just counting down, using your senses, and by the end of this, you're going to be a lot calmer. You're going to be a lot more in the here and now, and just ready to go on until we get bumped off our concentration game again, which we will. But hopefully this will buy you some time to be really present with yourself. So just to run those down, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. I think with that, I will stop. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, David. That's a great grounding technique. I do use it. I use 4-7-8 breathing. I use where are my feet. And in early recovery, grounding techniques are really, really necessary. And then in early relationship healing process for both sides, this kind of grounding technique can be really, really useful. So particularly during the holidays. So we're going to open it up for Q&A now. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions about anything to do with grounding techniques, but also anything to do with addiction, recovery, relationships, relationship healing, whatever you've got, we can probably give you an answer. And if we can't, we'll admit it. Okay, first question here. This is an interesting question. If a 15-year-old girl who is fully developed asks her 10-year-old brother to lay in bed with her because she's scared, and when he goes to her bed, she's naked, is that considered molestation, even if there's no touching?
Well, I don't know if molestation is actually a legal term or not, but this would, in my opinion, and Scott, I'm going to ask him to chime in on this too, that would, yes, it would be, even if there's no touching involved, the intent is there, and the emotion is there. Now, these are both minors, so that would be taken into account. But when I read this particular scenario, what really jumps out at me, whether or not it's molestation, and unfortunately, yes, it is, but what's going on with this young woman, or this young girl, right? Now she's fully developed, she's 15, but any girl that reacts that way have been what we call sexualized, right? Something has gone on here. No 15-year-old girl does this. When kids are sexualized too soon, meaning abused, enmeshment, improper boundaries, whatever form it takes, even early porn, we're seeing more and more girls looking at porn early on. It should also be the exposure that young men get a lot. But when that happens, these kids start to see themselves and their value in terms of sex and that kind of comfort and that sexual transaction. And, that really is something that hijacks their arousal template for life. So when I see this, that's my big concern, is like, what happened to this young girl? And I would really start to look, I know the boy will get attention for doing this, but both of these young people really need to have some help and assessment to see what's going on, because there's a lot more here than what we're seeing in these couple sentences, for sure.
Yeah. I think molestation is both a clinical and legal term, but and sexual offending has both clinical and legal definitions. The clinical definition for sexual offending is sexual activity without the other person's consent. And that can have touching or no touching involved. It can be voyeur, it can be exposure, it can be all kinds of things. The legal definition is whatever the law says it is, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the clinical definition is sexualized activity without someone's consent. And minors are considered unable to consent, both clinically and legally. 15-year-old girl, very much a minor, 10-year-old, very, very much a minor. If it's not incestual, usually if there's a split of more than about 3 years, it's considered highly inappropriate rather than sexual exploration. I mean, kids tend to play doctor and do weird things, but a split of more than 3 years, and that's what people outside the family, within the family, different definitions. There's what we call covert incest. There's what we call overt incest. Overt incest is obviously usually hands-on or very explicit visual kind of abuse. Covert is more of a sexualized emotional connection. It basically occurs when a child is parentified, turned into one of the parents' partners. And there's a sexualized element to that. All kinds of different forms of abuse. One of the things I run into and type some questions in for us, everybody. David, one of the things I run into in my online porn work groups is, I'll ask the guys, and one of the things I always want to know is, how old were you when you first saw porn? And, sometimes it's like 4, 5, 6 years old. As a matter of fact, often it's in that range or early pre-puberty, almost always, though not always. But it's, dad left it laying around, or grandpa had a room with all his porn in it and everyone knew, or the older brother was giving it to them. Is that a form of abuse, or is where do we draw the line here? I mean, if dad's got the porn hidden, is that different than if dad leaves it out on the bureau or in the bathroom? I mean, where do we draw the line? Is there a line?
Yeah, I think if we substitute porn for, say, alcohol or drugs, right? That's if there may be beer in the refrigerator of a home that the kid knows about and has access to, and versus father deciding to like share a beer or liquor with his son, at those kind of early ages. I think it's a matter of judgment. And I think with porn, the problem, unfortunately, I think we could compare porn much more to kind of crack cocaine than alcohol, because of the really high dopamine content that porn has. It's a much more powerful, believe it or not, addictive force than just plain old alcohol or marijuana or other kinds of things. It's dangerous. And so, and I don't mean from a moral point of view. I think I mean it from a point of view of what it does to the brain in terms of really setting up this expectation of really high dopamine from sexual activities. And we do honestly such a terrible job of sex addiction in this country that kids don't have any other point of reference than what they see in porn. They think that's what sex is. And there's been all kinds of disastrous occurrences when kids start to reenact, what they see, thinking that's normal. So, long story short, if it's left around the house at that early age, I think it's really, really, at best, highly irresponsible. But I think it's also worse. Now, I'm not sure we get into legal worse, but I think certainly when you're talking about enmeshment and where just there's no boundaries, a lack of boundaries in the home, and that's when kids get really mixed up messages about sex and what sex means and what it doesn't mean. And it doesn't mean what we would like it to mean in those cases, which is kind of a physical expression that leads toward intimacy and other kinds of, well-rounded, rich experiences. Here, it's often secretive, and the taboo factor is highly kind of evolved already, and it's images the kids doesn't understand with powerful forces. So I think it's a real problem. I'm ranting on here, but I think it's something that really parents need to be doing a much better job controlling, because we are now understanding that porn is a highly disruptive component of on your child's development, the brain development. It just is, and has lifelong ramifications.
Yeah. I'm going to add one more thing. We got another question, but type some questions in for us, please. Sex addiction and sex offending are not the same thing.
Right.
And sex addiction is never an excuse for sexual offending, nor is it an excuse for just straight up infidelity. There's crossover. A lot of addicts will enter into low-level offending, things like voyeurism and exhibitionism, and maybe they stumble on illegal porn and things like that, which the courts frown on, and can throw people in jail for a very long time, way too long. But sex addiction, you can be a sex addict without ever offending. You can be an offender without being an addict. A lot of offenders get caught offending, and they want to use sex addiction as an excuse. Most of the time they're not addicts, and either way, it's not an excuse. So we always try to be very, very clear. Sex addiction is one thing, sexual offending is another. There's often some overlap, but addiction is never an excuse for bad behavior. We do need to face our consequences, whether they're relational or legal. Okay, next one here, next question. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. I am a straight porn addict, sex addict. And as my addiction escalated, I started to use alcohol and substances to deal with performance anxiety. So performance anxiety. Now that I've been sober from substances for 3 years and I'm still working on my porn addiction, I find it difficult to be sexual without alcohol. It always causes performance anxiety. How long does this untangling take? Is there anything I need to do besides being sober to speed up my recovery process? Interesting questions there.
Yeah, and good for you for having some insight about how these things have become entangled, and your history as you developed these addictive patterns. We often see, well, let me back up. Alcohol, for one thing, is a terrible drug for sex. You can't get an erection. It impedes orgasm, but what it does really well is it disinhibits. And we very often see this at the beginning of the addictive cycle, people starting off with alcohol just to loosen things up, even if alcohol is not really part of their acting out down as later in the addiction cycle with, say, amphetamines and sex. So your performance and other substances, usually we see this, by the way, in the beginning for that to kind of get your nerve up, and at the end to kind of deal with the shame and the remorse of having acted out again, because the drugs like alcohol are much better kind of soothing and numbing that kind of emotional pain at the end. So, but your question, it's a good one of how do I untangle these things? And the problem is it takes time. The good news, alcohol is less of a bonding with these behaviors than amphetamines, but both of them still need to be kind of pulled apart. And I think the way I've really come to understand doing this is to two different recovery strategies, which you've done, which is abstinence from all substances, and then working your circle plan for your sexual addiction, so you know what behaviors are your bottom line behaviors and so on. But so it's really, one is we can't do abstinence from sex. We don't want to do sex. That's not the goal. We want to bring it back into our lives, but the substances have to be out of it. Where I have found people get in trouble is we're understanding more and more the power of fantasy in our mind. And even if people aren't actually using the alcohol or using the other drugs, cannabis being another really popular one for this same effect, they're thinking about that high. And it sounds crazy, but we know that just thinking about that high can start to release dopamine. Now, it's not as much dopamine as it from the real thing, but it's enough to keep you engaged and kind of distracted while you're looking at porn, but even not using the alcohol. But I would bet somewhere, if it's alcohol, cannabis, whatever the other drugs are, they're kind of woven into your thoughts. And I would say the more you can avoid that, the faster it's going to be to separate from it. Now, the other issue here that I often see is that when we get sober, we're not exactly reclaiming the healthy, wonderful sex and intimacy we had before. Most addicts didn't have it at all. And so when we get sober, sex is a whole big terrifying thing where all our anxieties and body shame and fears about performance and all this stuff comes up, and that's where addictive behaviors really perform like a buffer to help us get through it. All that's really very real, right, with no filters. And so I think dealing with your anxiety from just a pure anxiety point of view would be very useful in this process as well. So I talked a lot, but bottom line, try to really control where your minds go, and the thought police here by your fantasy, because fantasies will keep this pattern locked in place even if you're not using the alcohol. And second, really dealing with the anxiety that's there as a separate issue. I would bet in that case it may be related to trauma, or it might be just anxiety, but there are lots of really good ways to do that without having to medicate yourself with alcohol or drugs or something else.
Sorry, muted. Thank you, David. Okay, the next one here. My porn addict says that he had searched for naked pictures of children from nude beaches, meaning a family picture of a family with kids and a nude beach where they're all naked. He looked at this with the intent of seeing the kids naked, but according to him, it's not child porn because it was a nude family picture, but admits his intent was to see them naked. Does that make him a pedophile? What is a pedophile? What does it mean? Since he told me about this, I've been dying inside because it is so horrifying to me, and I don't understand it. I don't know who to ask. Also, I don't know if that's everything he has done involving children or child images. His main acting out has been porn. Also, he told me one time that he was scared because he saw some kids as beautiful children, in quotes, and that scared him. I'm sorry if this is too heavy. So, interesting question. David, thoughts? I know I have some, but I'll let you go first there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so it is often the case with sex addiction that because of the need for ever increasing escalation of stimulation for dopamine hit, somebody will start out and start looking at more and more taboo or fetishy or exciting or pictures that are a little bit edgy, and they can drift into underage porn at that moment. And in the eyes of the law, that's illegal. It's the same thing. They don't care if you're an addict or not. When I see a case like this, where there's so much interest that seems to be kind of pre-existing in children, it does concern me. And I think we know from the concept of not porn, right, that you don't have to look at explicit child porn. You can be looking at even pictures of children or pictures of nearly naked children, and getting a little bit of a dopamine rush from that if that's part of your arousal template. And so this is very concerning to me. I think he's a little bit fooling himself about the extent of it. It doesn't matter whether they're pornographic or not. This is a problem. What we find, by the way, there's two classifications. A pedophile is really someone attracted to someone who's not hit puberty yet, so a child. And we find that pedophiles can be attracted to boys or girls. It doesn't really matter. It's the child, the kind of hairless, very obviously childlike body that's the attraction. This is something that's really innate in many guys. It's really, really hard to deal with. And so it really requires specialized treatment that's well beyond the expertise of sex addiction therapists or CSATs. I think sometimes, by the way, the other ephebophile is the second one. For those are someone who's attracted to a teenager, and that's where we start to see more specific gender attraction, to young women or young men. But in all this said, I think this is really worrisome. And what I would recommend him is having an assessment by a proper person with the proper credentials to figure out what this is and what kind of help would best serve him. And maybe the trauma therapy would help, or supportive therapy, or some kind of behavioral therapy. I just don't know. But what you're seeing are symptoms and glimpses. And I agree with you. I think probably what he's owning up to, just because of shame that goes with this, I suspect there's more to it than he's admitted to here. So all the more reason to get an assessment, just to figure out where you stand and where he stands, and get the best help for him that you can. And
yeah. I mean, is this child porn? You can call it what you want, but you'll do hard time for it if you get caught. So in the eyes of the law, this is illegal. And they don't cut people a lot of slack. There are different categories of offending behaviors. There, especially when we're talking about child offenders like pedophiles and or habophiles. Pedophiles are often dedicated, like their primary and sole attraction is prepubescent children. Sometimes they're not dedicated. Sometimes they're what we call situational, where it pops up and it's like, oh, that's interesting. It's not their primary attraction, but it's somewhere in the arousal template. But often pedophiles are what we call dedicated. That is their primary attraction. It's hard to deal with that because, for obvious reasons, it's very hard to deal with that. Habophiles tend to, this is the attracted to adolescents, basically. And usually that occurs in conjunction with an attraction to adults. A lot of habophiles will have healthy adult relationships or relatively healthy adult relationships, and they offend what we call situationally. It presents itself, or they just start Googling and there it is. Much easier to treat from both an offender standpoint and the addiction standpoint. Addiction can lead people into this behavior, but this behavior can occur with or without an addiction. So when we get guys like this in treatment, we generally refer them out, do we not, David?
Oh yeah.
Because
or for them, at least before we bring them in, we try
to find out before they get here. Because we're not the right facility for them. We treat addiction. We treat sex addiction rather than sex offending. I'm with David. He needs to get an assessment with somebody who understands sexual offending. But before that happens, you need to figure out what the reporting requirements are in your state. In the state of California, if he walked in to see, Dr. Rob or somebody licensed here in California, they would have to report him. It would be legally obligated to report him. Most states, that is not the case. But you would need to find out in advance. Because once you're in the legal system, you are in the legal system and you don't get out. So
I believe Pennsylvania is the other state with that requirement, but you definitely need to check it out.
yeah, definitely check. Ask, you can ask a therapist, say, what are your reporting requirements? And they should tell you. And you could say, what are your reporting requirements around certain types of pornography? And they should be able to tell you, particularly if they specialize in offending or other sexual behaviors. So
the other thing in that regard, now California, for those of us licensed there, has this requirement. However, in every state, there's a requirement that if a therapist feels a child is endangered in the home, that is also automatically reportable. And a case could be made that might be the case here, with more details in a conversation with a therapist. So it's really important to get those reporting requirements. I agree with Scott totally.
Yeah. Okay, what resources do you recommend for a porn addict who was sexually abused as a child? Great question. So a porn addict who has a sexual abuse history as a victim.
Right. I think first of all, this is a very common scenario. We see that an awful lot of addiction, sex addiction or not, any kind of addiction, starts with what therapists call adverse childhood experiences, and including trauma. And that can be the kind of stuff we've talked about tonight, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse. It can be neglect. It can be some kind of weird household situation with, an immigrant family that doesn't speak the language, or a chronically depressed father, or a sick sibling. I mean, there's all kinds of factors that can go into it that can underlie this, but much of that can evolve into trauma. By the way, even things like bullying, chronic bullying, we're now discovering it's not. We think of trauma as like the major, horrible car accident or catastrophic earthquake or something, but chronic bullying can result in the same kind of thing. So those chronic stressors are also bad. So the good news here is that there is wonderful trauma therapies out there. More and more over the last 20 years, we've gotten very good at this. Everything from EMDR to hypnotherapy to brain spotting, and there's all kinds of really good techniques. The key in my mind with trauma therapy and addicts, or really trauma therapy in general, is that it has to have what's called a somatic or body component. You can't do trauma therapy sitting in a chair in an office talking about it. It requires a good bit of that, but it also requires starting to make connections with their body, because we know that trauma is often held not up here, but it's engaged in the body. And anybody's had a massage where you hit a point, you started crying or laughing, or that's an example of that. We've mentioned Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, a number of times. It's a beautiful summary of this process. So bottom line is, yeah, trauma therapy extremely useful. The one proviso I always say, as a recovering addict myself, I know that how much, when I was acting out and using, how much I depended on that to cope with the world. And when I first got into early recovery and I got sober, I had literally no coping skills. And so if I would have started trauma therapy at that point, it would have totally buried me. And so I recommend waiting at least a couple months in recovery before you start digging into the painful products of your past, right? Early recovery to me is crisis management. It's very present tense stuff. It's like, okay, how do I deal with this right now? How do I deal with this issue today? It's not what happened 20 years ago at this point. That's important, but the timing of when you deal with that is also important. So yeah, there's a lot more to say about that connection between it, but I think that will do.
Yeah. And when David says wait until a couple months of recovery, he's talking about you need to be sober for a couple months. You need to have started developing a support network of people who can talk you off the ledge so you don't relapse. I mean, the one thing we don't want is somebody going in and working on their trauma and relapsing because there's no support around them. So yeah, a couple of months of solid recovery and sobriety. Don't just show up at meetings for 2 months and keep using and then go jump into trauma therapy. That's not going to work very well.
Yeah, for sure.
So how can a sex addict who engages with prostitutes and in a way engages in and supports sex trafficking not be a sex offender? Anybody who engages with prostitutes is a sex offender legally. Sorry. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I think it's just, this is an example of how confusing this gets
Yeah.
between like the law of the land and our moral backgrounds and our shame and our innate desires. And, they all conflict here at some point, and learning how to navigate that is really important. But you're right. I mean, if you're engaging with sex workers, and that
Unless you're in
connected to
Nevada.
that's connected to some pretty unpleasant things, and in a way you're contributing to that whole ecosystem. So yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And like in Nevada, you might not be an offender because it's legal and it's also a consensual transaction between adults, but it could still be a form of sexual abuse or misuse of another person. So yeah, we try not to, at Seeking Integrity, we try not to place moral judgments on things like pornography and prostitution and things like that. But sex trafficking, we're not big fans. Child pornography, we are not fans. Legally consenting adults, who mutually agree to engage in behaviors, we're all for it. As long as it's legal, and you're not, hurting yourself or the other person or anyone else. But we're talking mutually consenting adults engaging in legal behaviors. We are very sex positive. The rest of the stuff, not so much.
Right, totally.
Okay, next one. I'm a gay man who knows I am addicted to sex because my dopamine levels are out of whack, yet I am still not setting enough boundaries. I have obsessive thoughts daily of getting on PrEP medication. David, you might need to explain what that is.
Right.
And becoming I'm not going to use that word, but a slut, basically, and attending all the orgies in LA, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll skip that beat, but I don't want to trigger people.
No, for
I
sure.
know there is hope for me, but various friends tell me sex addiction isn't real, and I should embrace my high sex drive. I go all in. I feel like the West Hollywood culture pushes promiscuity further and further for me. Interesting question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for writing, and thank you for saying all this. I think I'm a gay man as well, and one of the things I think the gay community does a kind of a disservice is kind of just normalizing all kinds of addictive behaviors, excessive addictive behaviors, whether it's alcohol or drugs or sex. And I'm, as a gay man, I know we've had a lot of discrimination and stigmatization and shame put on us. And so I understand the need to say, hey, wait a minute, this is my sex, back off. I'm going to do what I want to do. I've earned the right. And as Scott just said, yeah, we're very sex positive. We're two consenting adults. However, when signs of addiction start to creep in, it sounds like you're very definitely aware of them in your own life. At that point, where control is lost and where there's other kind of criteria we can talk about. But when that happens, we really need to take that into concern, because and with gay men, I think there's, with everybody, but I'm more familiar with a lot of the issues of gay men. But there's not only this idea of being sexual as a way of getting validation, of being seen, of belonging. It's kind of the currency. In many ways, gay sex is transactional. It's become so casual that people don't really think about it as a big deal. But I also know that guys who have, had hundreds of hookups and declared themselves the loneliest people on earth, to the point where they were really depressed and suicidal. So it's not a happy ending down that road when you take it. And I know that the gay community kind of defends it, but I think, boy, we're also starting to realize, at least where I am with fentanyl and some of the overdose deaths that are just wiping out large sections of our gay communities right now, we've got a problem. And so I think, yeah, there's this. The other thing I'd mention here is that sometimes we can have very, very destructive tendencies as gay men. This can be shame, it can be abuse, this can be the result of trauma that we've talked a lot about tonight. But this idea of becoming, of getting high and going out and just becoming a receptacle for other people is a really self-destructive one that really just screams, this need for validation and low self-esteem and other kinds of stuff too. So I really, really, really encourage you to get into some kind of therapy to help with this, because not only can they provide you some tools, and there's honestly, a lot of programs in West Hollywood and elsewhere that might be harm reduction or treatment. And I think, frankly, you've gone beyond the harm reduction, which is the goal of which is to maybe cut down. But I think to really see what options are available to you. And the beautiful thing about LA, I think there's a lot of program options no matter what your income is. So especially around this issue. So please get some help. This is something that's only going to get worse. And I've seen too many gay men die. Seriously, I'm not trying to scare you, but it's just this is a deadly issue right now in our community. So please get help.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on what is PrEP medication,
Oh,
and
yes.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
And keep in mind we're talking to an addict here, so that your thoughts might be different with a non-addict versus an addict in terms of PrEP. So go ahead.
Right. So PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. It basically is the administration of 2 HIV medications to someone who doesn't have HIV, but who may be at risk for getting it if they're having uncontrolled, condomless sex, for example. And so it allows guys, or anyone really, men and women, to have unprotected sex and not risk seroconverting should they be exposed to the HIV virus. It's extremely effective. And it's now there's programs in every state in the country to provide it, usually free or at very low copays. And it just works. There's a downside. You have to have blood. Actually, there's a good side. You have to have your blood drawn every 3 months. They do that because the downside is that it can have some liver issues and kidney issues. But that also keeps you engaged with healthcare for 3 months, and you're providing to your doctor. And they found it actually has been empowering to people, and actually sexual, kind of reckless sexual intercourse seems to actually go down. So PrEP is a good thing. And I think I recommend, if even if my clients are in early recovery, even if they're doing well, I think PrEP is a good idea for a while. Now, PrEP has this kind of psychological thing too. I think when somebody in recovery goes back on PrEP, for example, then that kind of opening the floodgate here, potentially, it's like at least in my brain, it's like, okay, this is like a permission slip, and at that point, yeah, we're getting the safety from HIV, and not, by the way, from anything else. Gonorrhea or any other STI is not affected by PrEP, and those rates are going through the roof. But we need to be really cautious and have a good conversation. And always, I think when PrEP is on board with recovering gay sex addict, particularly, that's where accountability systems really have to be important. To sponsor honesty, integrity, accountability with what you're taking, what you're doing, and so on.
Yeah, and just in terms of, various friends tell me sex addiction isn't real. Trust me, sex addiction is real, because I lived it. I still deal with it on a daily basis. It destroyed my life, and it took me a long time to develop a new life. It's real, and I've seen thousands of sex addicts over the years. And yeah, read the book Sex Addiction 101 by Dr. Rob. If you identify, then sex addiction is real, and I don't care what people say about it, if it is or it isn't. And there are therapists out there who insist it's not real. And they do more harm than good when they're dealing with sex addicts.
And I would encourage you to try a meeting if you haven't already, a 12-step meeting. There's open and closed meetings. Find an open one. And depending on your drug of choice, you may find that Crystal Meth Anonymous is one that you can relate to, but there's also NA and AA and a lot of the SA too. There's a great sex addiction meeting. So check them out and see how you feel, and run this question by, what your friends say, and see what feedback you get.
Yeah, there are SCA Sexual Compulsives Anonymous meetings that meet at the Gay and Lesbian Center, which is right there in Hollywood, I guess, not West Hollywood. That's where I got sober, and they're great, and they're still there. And they're mostly gay men. You'll identify very, very well. Highly recommend that. And other meeting venues in West Hollywood, they're all over there. Yeah. Okay, I am a sex addict. I've been seeking help since March. I see my CSAT and attend several meetings weekly. I feel like I'm stalled in my recovery. Is this normal? What a great question, David.
Yes, I'm just looking at the time frame since March. Okay, well, it's interesting too. I think when we go through the phases of recovery, right? The first, I mentioned earlier tonight, the first couple months of recovery, I think of kind of crisis management, present tense, have their own intensity in a way, often negative intensity because of a lot of the situations we've created in our active addiction. But it's very intense in the beginning. And I think after, 4 or 5 months, if we're working our program, we have systems in place, our lives can start to get a little calmer and more routine. And I've seen, actually, it sounds counterintuitive, but I've seen that be a problem for people sometimes. It gets too quiet, too repetitive, too boring, and people don't want to have to be boring. And so it gets a little zitsy. And however, that's one thing that happens. I also have seen, though, that people start to do the things and get into repetition and are kind of skimming a little bit. I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but maybe not diving as deeply as they could into the work. After this period of months, I would start to suspect you're working on the 4th step and maybe doing some deeper digging in terms of other issues. Because, really giving up the substances or the acting out behavior is that's literally step 1, right? That's just the beginning. And then it starts about creating a life of sobriety and recovery and what that feels and looks like. And I think when we kind of bump up, and this happened in my recovery too, the second half of my first year and the first half of my second year, I was kind of in this like doldrums, like, where am I? Because there's a lot of stuff I didn't want to open the door to and dive into. I was kind of picking and choosing what issues I wanted to deal with. And I was staying sober, but I also didn't feel like I was moving forward at all. And the savior for me was a really good therapist who guided me in terms of, okay, let's put these 3 issues on the shelf, but let's look at this one now. And I needed that kind of coaching to figure out a plan of action. So you may need that. But it's just, I think the attitude is there, you're trying to do the work, but I think this is a sign that something's not quite working in your program, something needs to be adjusted. And that may be something that you can't figure out on your own. You need some help with other people's wisdom.
Yeah. And in addition to beginning the work on the underlying issues, you might want to revisit your circle plan. For those of you who don't know what a circle plan is, it's 3 circles. Like the bullseye is red, the next circle is yellow, and the next circle is green. The red circle, we write all of our problem bottom line behaviors. The yellow circle, we write all of our slippery behaviors and thoughts and feelings and places. The green circle, this outer circle, is healthy behaviors and fun behaviors. You may need to revisit your green circle and add some hobbies and activities that involve other people that you enjoy. You may need to add some fun in your life. That's a good thing to do when you feel stalled. And then the other very 12-steppy thing to do when you feel stalled is to be of service. Yes. It's time to become a sponsor. It's time to secretary a meeting. It's time to volunteer for hospitals and institutions. It's time to be of service. The best way I can get out of a rut when I'm in recovery is to start being of service. I've done most of the underlying issues work, but that's David's right. It's time to work on the underlying issues too.
Right, but to get out of ourselves is so important, like you just said, Scott, through service or whatever form that looks like. That's so important. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's also a great way. Those of us with low self-esteem, we have tons of shame. You want to develop some self-esteem, behave in esteemable ways, and that involves being of service and also thinking of fun things to do and inviting people along. I didn't think I deserved to have any fun, but I did think it was obligated to be of service. So part of my service work was to think of fun things to do and invite people. That's how I convinced myself it was okay to have some fun. So
great, I love that.
Sometimes we have to manipulate ourselves a little bit. But yeah. Another good one here is chemsex addiction common in the gay community? Yes. Are there communities for straight chemsex addicts similar to CMA, but for straight men? So a straight guy who's a chemsex addict, where can he go?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. The idea of the word chemsex was coined by a guy in the UK, meaning the use of drugs and sex in the gay community. And he talked about all the unique factors of the gay community. We were talking about sexual revolutions earlier, but HIV and the long shadow that had in the community and discrimination and so on. So he was looking at this drug sex phenomenon as a way to deal with these issues in that environment. And they exist. That's a legitimate way to frame that problem. The downside of that framing is that it makes people think, well, chemsex is a gay problem, but not another problem, right? Because the word we're trying to honor, who's a friend of mine, he passed away last year, trying to honor that definition of chemsex. But what we're really talking about here is co-occurring drug use and sex. And gay men have no monopoly on that, right? Everybody has the potential to do that. A lot of people that consider themselves sex addicts and porn addicts also dally in substances in a really addictive way, and they may not even know it. Maybe the cannabis or the alcohol or the benzodiazepines to come down, or whatever people are doing. There's often drugs. If we look at the larger addiction ritual, they're often mixed in there. The problem with chemsex is that there's really no good place to talk about it. Generally, the drug meetings, AA, NA, CMA, and by the way, CMA is open to everybody, men, women. It's not a gay thing. It just happened a lot of gay men are going there, but it's open to men and women, straight. And by the way, I'm seeing more and more straight guys using drugs in this way, some straight sex addicts using drugs. But I think what we have to do is find a place, because as I was saying, the drug meetings don't want to hear about sex issues. The sex addiction meetings really don't want to hear about drugs. And so people that have both, that are all fused in their addictive ritual, have a really hard place to go to find a safe place to talk about it. For that reason, I myself created the chemsex support group that's on Seeking Integrity here on Sex Relationship Healing, Tuesday evenings at 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. The link is here on Sex and Relationship Healing, or sex. Yeah, you'll see it on Tuesday nights at that time. But that's a place where men and women gather to talk about how drugs and sex work together in their addiction, and what they can do to talk about it. So there's very few resources. I'm also trying to finish a book on co-occurring drug use and sexual behavior for everybody. My specialty for 20 years has been working with amphetamines and sex in gay men. And so I have a good history of that. But everybody, men, women, gay, straight, alcohol, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, all kinds of different drugs, all kinds of different people have this issue. And as addicts, we can weave together any of those substances behaviors into an addiction. So it's a really important thing. We are at a real deficit of where to talk about it. And I'm ranting here again. Treatment centers across the country don't do a good job at this. The drug and alcohol places will basically ignore sex addiction, porn addiction, gambling addiction, food addiction. They don't know what to do about it. They're not trained to deal with it, and they kind of just ignore it, to the terrible detriment of the client. Seek Integrity probably is honestly the single facility in the United States that recognizes this and frames it this way. And that's largely because of me and Dr. Rob and the work we do and how well it fits together. So be cautious, but come to our Tuesday night meeting, at least. I think you'll find support.
Yeah, that Tuesday night meeting is great. When David's not available, I usually fill in for him. And it's about, what, 2/3, 1/3 gay, straight, would you say?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a mix, and the guys are really supportive. There really needs to be a 12-step program for chemsex instead of guys being forced to split their time between CMA and a sex program. I do find the sex programs are more willing to listen to people whose sexual problems are triggered by drugs or co-occurring than the drug programs, because a lot of people in CMA, at least in my experience, and I'm not a meth user, but I've never used it, but I've been to enough meetings. A lot of them are chemsex addicts, but they're only willing to treat the substance part of it. They think if they treat that everything will get fixed, and that's not how it works. I mean, David, could you take a second and elaborate on both halves?
Yeah, in the preamble I do for our chemsex support group on Tuesday nights, I talk about and I've had professionals tell clients that later came to see me these exact words over and over again. Just get sober from your drugs and alcohol, and the sex will take care of itself. And no, it won't. when we've incorporated both sides of sex and drugs into our addiction, you're leaving one side of addiction to just burn in flames. You can't just ignore it. And so finding a place that can handle both. And as I mentioned earlier, it's two different strategies, right? Because at that point, drugs and alcohol have to be an abstinence-based strategy. I never have to touch alcohol again in my life. But that's not the case with sex. We don't want to be absent from sex. We want to invite sex back in, but in a healthy way. And such a simple thing to say, but when they have been all tied and tangled up with drugs and alcohol, we have to do that untangling, and that takes time. As somebody earlier had said, how hard that is. So yeah, we have to work at that. I will say too, be careful if you're coming from the drug side. SA, for example, I would not be very friendly toward this, but other SCAA and SLAA, in my experience, are the two best meetings. SA, I don't know, maybe all of the others besides SA.
And it kind of depends on what part of the country you're in, which meetings are the strongest. But on the coast, SA and SCA and SLA tend to be really strong. In my experience, SAA and SCA tend to be a place where you can talk about substances fairly safely. Right. And I think we even have a specific meeting where I live, just like for the guys who are pretty much chemsex addicts, so that they can have a specific place to talk. But David's Tuesday group, definite. We have another question here, but I don't think we have nearly enough time to give it a proper answer. So I'm going to save this for next week. And I promise it'll be the first question we answer next week. Okay. And with that, we're actually out of time. So, okay, David, thank you for being here. Anything you want to say to take us out?
And just remember that 5 technique breathing grounding exercise, everybody. It really, really works. And have a great, happy, and safe New Year, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.